So to everyone who is here, I want to thank you. Welcome to our event, Pants and Pockets on Butch Culture and Style. For those who don't know, this event is based on an article by Kerry Manders, who will be joining us today, who is online, which was featured in T, the New York Times Style magazine in April 2020. In this article, a number of prominent Butch and stud people were featured, including our moderator Casey Legler, and our panelists, Roberta Colindrez and Tiona Nekkia McClodden. Today's session will be recorded so that it can be made available to people who are unable to attend. We ask that everyone ensure they keep the space safe and respectful for everyone. Anyone who acts or writes anything inappropriate will be removed, no questions asked. My name is Natalie Ramtahal. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the manager of the Panelist, a dedicated research space at the Faculty of Communication and Design at Ryerson University, and a member of Ryerson's Positive Space Employee Network. I am also queer, cisgendered, a woman of color, and who self-describes as hard femme. As we will be talking about style today, I wore a plaid shirt as a shout out to my queer community. I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of our attendees for joining us, to the Dean's Office for their continued support and assistance with these events, Michael Turco, who I stole much of this intro from, Antoinette Mercurio, who is a friend and colleague who made all of this happen, the Catalyst team, obviously, for their support, and of course, our amazing panel. Before we begin, I think it's important for us to acknowledge the land, even if we are not on the same land right now. Ryerson University is built on land taken from Indigenous people, specifically the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee, as part of an ongoing colonial relationship that we all must acknowledge and strive to overturn. If you're joining us from anywhere in the Americas or Oceania, you can learn more about the land you're on and who it belongs to by going to native-land.ca. And while we're here to celebrate Pride 2020, we can't do so without recognizing the events and protests that have been unfolding these last few weeks. The fight for racial equality and the fight against anti-Black racism continues. We stand in solidarity with the Black community. Pride as we know it today began because of the Stonewall riots in New York in 1969. Stormé de Laverney was a Butch lesbian whose scuffle with the police was, according to Stormé and many eyewitnesses, the spark that ignited the Stonewall riots, spurring the crowd into action. She was born in New Orleans to an African-American mother and a white father. She is remembered as a gay civil rights icon and entertainer. In the words of Michael Turco, there can be no pride unless we value human life, justice, and equity above all else, particularly property, money, patriarchy, white supremacy, and blissful ignorance. This brings me to our amazing panel. This panel is based on an article, as I had mentioned, by Kerry Manders for the New York Times T magazine. The section was called Legends, Pioneers, and Survivors. I want you to take that in for a second. These people who are on this panel are considered legends, pioneers, and survivors. The full title of the article that they were featured in is The Renegades, the butches and studs who defied the male gaze and redefined culture. It was released in April 2020. The link will be posted for you. The panel started with a Google Hangouts message from me to Antoinette that said, "Have you read this?" And I sent the link to the article. Antoinette responded with, "I know Kerry. She's a friend of mine. She's a writer, a photographer. She used to teach here at Ryerson." I knew it was kismet. We had a conversation about how great it would be to do a panel with a writer and some of the people who were featured in the spread. Antoinette offered to reach out to Kerry to see if she would be interested. Kerry was interested. We had a great conversation about what this panel could look like, who would be included, what we could talk about. She suggested that we connect with Casey. Casey Legler, if you do not know, is a writer, former Olympian, and the first woman, in quotation marks, signed to Ford to exclusively model men's fashion. So Kerry reached out to Casey, and much to our delight, Casey was on board. Katie was adamant about having a panel that was diverse and reflective of queer, mask, gender non-conforming, mask of center folks who were represented in this article. They had some suggestions like Roberta Colindrez, who you may have heard of. Roberta, for those of you who do not know, is a Mexican-born Argentinian Honduran actor who typically plays non-traditional roles in television, film, and theater. Perhaps you heard of I Love Dick, stars Vida and the Deuce. And the other name that crossed Casey's lips was Tiona Nekkia McClodden, an art world hashtag boss. She is making waves in visual arts as a visual artist, filmmaker, and curator whose work explores and critiques issues at the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and social commentary. She is a recipient of the Bucksbaum Award and a Guggenheim Fellowship in Fine Arts, both from 2019, amongst other accolades. Without further ado, here's our amazing panel. Casey will be our moderator, Kerry, Tiona, and Roberta will be our panelists. Please feel free to send your questions in the question and answer section of Zoom. We'll reserve about a half an hour at the end for audience questions. Over to you guys.
All right. Oh, thank you. I feel like being like, yeah.
You guys are pretty brilliant, right?
We should have each come into our own song, you know.
Totally. As an aside, speaking of songs, when I was modeling and I was showing up on these sets and these interviews, I was so nervous of like fucking up and not representing because there weren't a lot of us. And so I would listen to Eminem's One Shot. Really loud. So the secret's out. And I was like, I cannot mess this up. So anyway, Natalie, thank you for having us.
Relieve the pressure on a situation?
It actually relieved it because I mean it was Eminem in one shot. Like I understood the kind of like ridiculousness of it, but it felt important, you know. Natalie, thanks for having us. Thank you to Ryerson and Catalyst. And thanks to everyone for showing up and being on the panel. I loved seeing everyone's reaction to their introduction because it's so true. Like you guys are such massive players, each in your fields, and it's such a privilege and an honor to like walk next to you guys, much less have a conversation. So thanks for giving us the chance, and I'm glad that there was a relationship there that allowed for this to happen. So I guess we'll just like dive right in. And prior to this, just so the kind of listeners and viewers know kind of where we're going, we talked about like just generally speaking about kind of like our histories and where we come from, what our understanding of butchness is, and then just vibe off of that. So as I was kind of writing the notes of our conversation, Roberta, you were the first one who, that's actually your name. These are my notes.
No.
But a lot of them are crossed out, and there's actually just a small section so that we can just go with it, you know. But Roberta, I was wondering if you could just kind of start us off and talk about kind of where you come from, and maybe just like diving right into the term butch and what your kind of arrival into that space meant for you. Okay. Or you can just like ping it to someone else if you want to.
Yeah, I probably will. So I was born in Mexico, and I moved to the United States when I was like 5. And I didn't have, something that I've been thinking about a lot because of this panel and just in general is just like I didn't really have queer icons at all. Like I just, kind of was shielded from it, especially because I'm Latin American, and I think that we just have conserved such a heteronormative understanding of the way the world works, and still do. And so I just didn't, I grew up without any like queer icons or even knowing that they existed. I didn't consider it. But then I started acting. I've been acting for several years now professionally. And so of course I think a lot about representation, especially when it comes to lesbians. I do, believe it or not, play a lot of lesbians.
You do, and you play them so well. It's like you know what you're doing. It's just,
yeah. So
typecasting.
So yeah. I mean, it's like a you know, an exercise in complete patience to even read breakdowns for auditions for queer characters. It's still the same shit, and especially when they're Latin. And we can get into this later. I know this is just kind of an intro, but you know, there aren't character descriptions about lesbians that don't include the first descriptor being lesbian. You know, it has to be super clear for people to be able to identify someone by that. And I see that kind of as a problem. And also I'm just like less and less interested by that as a descriptor. Like, why can't we just figure that out during the show, you know? And yeah, like everything that goes into describing, especially butch characters, is really, it's outdated, and it's sometimes still kind of, it's insulting. It's just like so one-dimensional that, you know, I hope that we can do something about it.
So we talked a little bit about like the one-dimensionality of those descriptors. Can you talk a little bit more about what those are? And then I'm interested in, because I have them if you want. They're really pretty like deplorable.
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's okay. So when you get a character breakdown that's a lesbian, she's always tough as nails, takes no shit from anyone, like, you know, covered in tattoos, has a drinking problem, like been in and out of jail, you know, just like it's this person has had it rough or has made it rough on themselves. Generally you see them at bars for the first time that you meet a lesbian character. You see them first at a fucking bar, or, you know, getting teased by some dudes outside of a bar for being gay. If it's a butch character, it's always someone from the wrong side of town. It's always someone who grew up poor or is poor. And yeah, I mean, like, think a lot of the butches that we see on screen nowadays, it's getting better, and we have, like, you know, people that are kind of like, you know, hotter or whatever, more traditionally, but it's still kind of, it's bleak. All the descriptors are bleak, and the understanding of what it means to be butch is extremely limited.
Right. Because I mean, I think there's this challenge that we talked about reconciling like masculinity and any sort of feminism, like just principles that have nothing to do with misogyny and patriarchy. And I would love to kind of, we can dive back into there, and go ahead, Roberta. And then I would love to hear.
It's true that even culture
we talked about kind of where that comes from the South as well.
Right. When you have queer characters or butch characters in TV that are white, you know, sometimes they do have like a decent job at a bank or something like that. Yeah. When they're Latin, they have, or Black, they're usually, again, with the tough as nails thing, and they take on these characterizations of being super, like a lot of the Latin butch characters that I read, I've had to consciously like talk to the showrunner or creator and be like, I want to kind of push against the possessiveness that is like a super stereotypical Latin male quality of just being like super unhinged jealousy all the time. And yeah, those are things that just, they're extremely prevalent. And
Tiona, can you tell us a little bit about where you kind of come from?
Yeah, for sure. I am born and raised in the South. I was born in Blythe, Arkansas, and I was, after a couple of years, 6 years in London, and with the military, coming from a military family, landed in Greenville, South Carolina, where I was actually raised and, you know, educated and stuff like that. So I come from a Southern Black culture, a deeply rooted identity. I had a bit of a fortune in the sense that I was like out the first time I like said I liked women was in middle school to like my siblings, and then another friend who also was a lesbian. So I had this like experience also throughout high school of being out and sneaking off to the only club that catered to Black gay folks, and primarily I would say at the time a lot of Black women, which informed my whole idea of what was possible. And so it ended up being a pretty much like, I guess, a very strong intersubjective range of what butch could be, because I, of course, was just like my natural disposition, and I like really truly believe in it, was like something of like a butch child. I was always a tomboy. And this, I could point that to having an opportunity to have a mom who sold my clothes up until a certain age and would let me pick out patterns. So it comes from early formative, like, you know, not having money, but also being able to really like create your own fashion. And it was always, I was always drawn to the shorts sets with the vests and all that shit. And yeah, those things were also easier to grow into. So it kind of was like a functionality, but then it just really was a comfort level. But then I think some of the other ideas around butchness, especially like Black women, come from a range. You know, like my first love of ideas of butch were the more firm, farther in was the bull dagger. You know, I was like so captivated because it was like such a profane thing, but I thought it was just so beautiful. Like the women who like occupied that space were the most beautiful and the strongest, and you know, had this kind of way of moving in their bodies that was super comfortable, that I really wanted, and I saw a possibility of that. And then I was actually like a little afraid of the butches that I grew up with, because that was like money. Like they didn't have money, but they were the ones that worked on the factory, and they like kind of tricked off on the women. And I was just like, yo, it just seemed a little crazy. You know, the like three, like a girlfriend, you see them all fighting in the, you know, the bars as a 16-year-old, and you're just like, oh my God, this is a lot of drama. But I had this huge range. And then, you know, other ones that would pull me to side and talk about truly in their own ways, masculinity, and how to hold it in a woman's body. Like, you know, like they're like, you know better, so you should do better, basically based off of like standpoint, you know, like, so, you know, this is things you should never do to a woman. Very much chivalry, like, because I, my upbringing also with my mother, who raised me mostly, was being raised by a Southern Belle woman. So it was just like, I had that in my body as a kid, a little boyish girl, you know, who had to take care of her mom. So I was like, the opening doors and all that kind of stuff was like part of the whole like Southern engagement. So that's kind of the culture where I come from. And really having to proclaim it came from also growing up parallel to cotillions and botillions. These presentation moments that are very big, I think, in a lot of people's culture. I never have money to be in a cotillion, but I was in a botillion. I was the date of this like then closeted gay boy. And so we had these like, you know, rites of passages that, you know, taught me a lot about who I was, and that butch wasn't just clothing. I was a butch in a dress. I was a butch in an A-line dress. It was really hard to get that shit out. I literally had to stand still to not like be like, yo, this is not working.
You know, I can relate to this idea of coming from the South. I too was raised by a Southern belle, but I was raised to be a Southern belle. So there was this expectation that that I be ladylike, and any like my siblings, when I finally came out and kind of like stopped wearing dresses, they were like, thank God, because it was weird for everybody. But you know, this girl that I fell in love with very early on, like I was 20, just came out. She had long curly hair, totally femme presenting, and I was like totally into her. And then she chopped her hair, became butch. And in that moment, I was like, you know, there was no context for two butches. And I was like, suddenly, well, you know, I also was just getting clean and out of my mind. So like a crazy person. And I was like, leaving was not an option, or reconciling my own desire was not an option. So I grew my hair and I went back into the closet as a butch person. So I have some photos that still are so hard for me to look at, not because of what I look like, but because I was so willing and like weirdly able to just tuck that in. And it makes me think of that song, Roberta, in Fun Home about keys, right? Like where that character, go ahead.
I mean, I had a total Ring of Keys moment in my own life. The first time I even remember seeing a lesbian, I was in a grocery store called Apple in Houston. I grew up in Texas as well. It's less about being Southern and more about just being Texan.
Yeah.
But
so real.
But I just remember being in the grocery store with my mom, and I loved going to the grocery store, and I would just like follow her feet around and like purposely get lost and stuff. And then one day I got lost, and I looked and I saw a pair of boots, like work boots. And I was like, oh, you know, and I knew I was by the door, and I looked up and it was just like a butch dyke, which at the moment I wasn't like, that's a butch lesbian. You know, I saw like a strong woman with like cargo jeans and like a tucked in polo and like, you know, those like Blade Runner glasses and shit. And I was just like, I just remember thinking like, wow, she's strong, like cool. You know, I was just super into her, and my mom was not into the fact that I was fascinated by this woman. And, you know, and it was just like immediate, you know, she said some, you know, I don't want to paint my mom as a terrible person, but she looked at me and she was like, oh, stop looking at her. Those people belong in the circus. And I was like, okay, so women, and somehow I knew like that woman, it likes women. And I thought to myself, okay, so women that like women belong to the circus, which when you're a kid isn't entirely a bad thing, because I was like, and perform and wear cool clothing and like hang out with elephants and lions and shit and be gay, like, okay, that's a cool lifestyle, you know? And I guess it backfired for my mom. But yeah, it was years before I was just so deeply closeted. It was years before, and deeply religious, I think, that it was years before I even realized like my connection to being fascinated by this woman.
Oh, yeah, right. Kerry, what about you? Kind of, where do you come from?
I grew up a tomboy, and I just realized listening to everyone that I'm the only Canadian on the panel. I grew up in southwestern Ontario, actually in farm country, so kind of in the middle of nowhere. Closest town had, you know, fewer than I think 4,000 people, but it was an extremely white, straight, middle-class background. I didn't have sort of lesbian mentors or lesbian role models, as Roberta said, until I was older. But what I did have on the farm, in a lot of ways, was really perfect for me, because I was a tomboy, and in some ways I use that word still for myself more than I ever use butch or queer. I'm a tomboy at heart. So the farm meant for me driving tractors and riding motorbikes and snowmobiling, and it meant, you know, my beloved BMX bike. It meant wearing hand-me-downs from, you know, older male cousins. And there's a certain acceptability, not just on the farm, but I think we all know in tomboyness in general, right? It's okay. Girls are supposed to be like that, or some girls are supposed to be like that. The thing about it is, that I found though, is that you're supposed to, it's tolerated to a certain extent, up to a certain point. And that point, I think, is often temporal. We're supposed to grow out of it, right? So it wasn't until I was in high school that my mom started talking to me about, you know, my being might intimidate male suitors. I walked like a guy, right? My gait was too much like a strut. My steps were, and I so vividly remember this conversation, my steps were too far apart. I was coached to walk with, you know, not step so far, and to sit with my legs, not with my knees not so far apart, because it wasn't feminine, right? None of that coaching sort of started to happen until high school, when I was supposed to be different. Casey, you wanted to jump in and like?
No.
Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted to jump in.
No.
What I did want to say though about growing up in farm countries, while I didn't have any role models to look to who were lesbian, I think of the butch women that I can remember, and I don't know, butch is probably not the right word, because they were straight. And I keep thinking about this panel and female masculinity not always being lesbian. Absolutely. Right? My models for female masculinity were these tough farm women who were also wives and mothers, but who had leathery tan skin from working the fields, who had calloused hands, and there was nothing to be ashamed of about that, right? They were strong, like that was the way to be a woman on the farm, a kind of female virility. And Roberta, I was thinking about this point when you talked about these notes you get about what, you know, butch or lesbian characters are supposed to be. And we still, I think, as a culture, have an impossible time prying apart masculinity and maleness.
Mm-hmm.
Right? This and we're all talking about models of female masculinity, but I find so often the question always comes back to the ways in which we're somehow failed or emasculated or abjected men rather than women of a different kind. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah, I do. There's like, if I can think about it, I'm like the first lesbian role model for me was like Suge Avery from The Color Purple. That's just like in the text, but also the visual. The first Butch, if I'm seeing on film, is Miss Sophia.
Right.
That movement, that's like, I have an aunt that's like Miss Sophia, you know what I mean? And there's like something very valuable there, because one of the big poignant moments that happens in the narrative when Celie, because of her own trauma and her own abuse, tells Hoppo to beat her. That's how to get her to get out of this like threatening male, masculinity that's threatening him, and I think like what happens later on in that relationship when they come back together and they have their pants shop, that she makes these pants, it's something that really struck me, because that's the kind of women that I also, when my mom took me back to Blytheville, Arkansas, where she grew up and where I was born, her whole critique about the bull dagger was like, don't be this in this way, because you will come up against a violence.
Yes.
Yeah, it was always about like, don't do that because of the violence that will come on the other hand, that will beat you into this like, way of being. So.
Yeah, it makes me think of the desire, like everything that, Kerry, what you were just saying, Roberta, is kind of like this need to contain the Butch masculinity, like either in descriptors, or it makes me think, I just watched Disclosure, the documentary, and they have this really beautiful moment where one of the interviewees says, look, let's not forget, they were talking about Orange is the New Black, that this type of sex and this gender, in this case, a transgender character, are still incarcerated. That was the best that storytelling could do, right? Like that all of these dykes and butches and trans folks could only exist if they were incarcerated. And then, so I think about what it means. I think I had a tutor, because I learned English and then learned French and sucked at both for a while. And so I had a French tutor who would come, and in hindsight, I remember her she was a dyke, right? It also makes me think of like what it means to be butch and what it means to be feminine and what it means to be masculine is not applicable across cultures, countries, states. It's like, it's not a monolith, right? Like I remember when I finally went back to college and ended up in Massachusetts, it was like very much, Kerry, what you described, where it was like moms who were like on the farm wearing plaid and who would like there was nothing, it was Northampton, so they were, queer friendly, but there was nothing queer about them. They were just like, this is the utility, and also this is my female masculinity. Like there's nothing, and in some cases they were like, there's nothing masculine about me. This is my femininity. Absolutely. Right? And I just think, so anyway, all of those things kind of came to mind. And when we were talking about prepping for the panel, we were talking about reconciling more specifically. So there are two directions that we can go in, right? But I was thinking kind of reconciling masculinity with feminist principles, or a kind of principles that aren't, kind of subjected to violence, either being the recipient and or the kind of like aggressive giver of violence, and what that was like for each of you. Or I guess we could just go there. That feels interesting.
Well, you talked about how, I don't know if you're comfortable talking about drugs.
Oh yeah, I wrote a book about it. So,
Queer friendly and drug friendly space.
But you talked about like how selling drugs, it was just like a feeling of safety and security because of your masculinity. And and it's like, I never considered it, you know, like until you said that, like, right, I always felt more safe because of this, even though like it's a clear target to be gay, of course, like, you know, but I felt physically safer, even though I'm like 5'4" and like small, you know, it lended a feeling of physical safety that I just never even considered.
Yeah, and I think that all of us, you know, at some point have to reconcile the privilege that masculinity that we embody offers us. But it also makes me think of our brothers and sisters in like South Africa, who, if they look like us, are subjected to corrective rape. It offers no protection at all, right? So whereas for me, definitely, when I was dealing drugs, the fact that I was like a little off my rocker and 6'2" and dressed like a dude, they were like, well, Casey, like, you don't want to fuck with that person. And it offered me some protection, but it did not offer me an absence of fear. Like it didn't, there was no, and I think that took a while for me into my, you know, I've been clean for a long time, but it took a while into my 20s to understand that for me, my embodied butchness or masculinity did not necessarily mean the absence of fear, and that they're actually, you know, I had to learn through the generosity of, you know, a lot of people, but particularly my wife now, what it meant to be soft and what it meant to kind of have a, you know, maybe Tiona, what you were talking about, which was to unlearn everything I had learned about being a man, which I'm not. Like it was, you know, it's complicated.
Yeah. Especially when it gives you, it allows you to bypass a lot of the horror of what it means to be a feminine woman in certain kind of professional spaces. Like I know for me, when I was early, like PA work, like when I was trying to do like, you know, music videos, I worked on a lot of music videos early on in my career. They were some of the most toxic spaces. I think they were even more toxic than film sets because they were so fast. And at the time I was doing like work, it's like 2003, 2002 to 2006. So I'm looking at like this golden era of the last of the $1 million hip hop videos and the creation and the, you know, establishment of the quote unquote video vixen. And the core of the music that was being put out at the time and the visuals changed very, very sharply to accommodate like YouTube happening in 2005, right? So it was more like this hard push towards aesthetic. And when I was going on those sets, I without a doubt to this day, I say the way that I traversed those sets versus my more feminine women friends, et cetera, was night and day, to the point where I would have to be very considerate about even escorting women, you know, femme women through different areas because of the way they would be held up, or, you know, checking other folks, you know, around the language that they use. And I've dealt with that in many, many spaces. And, you know, I've had to like, you know, vocally check or, you know, be accountable in the space because otherwise it would not be, you know, touched on, because it is something that if you, you know, I know what it is because that's the same kind of way that I had to grow up as a young girl, like with a very dominating and very violent father. I know, and I can see those, you know, without language, you know, moments, but there still are these like learnings that I'm happening that sometimes I just don't know, why is this energy happening over here? And then I'm like, oh, an hour later, I'm like, oh shit, this is because they know that, you know, they see a certain kind of like masculinity, equate that with this like strength, whereas they don't put that or allow that with, you know, some feminine women, and causes them a lot of like, you know, psychological horror in some of the spaces where I'm able to kind of be aloof at times. So, I mean, I've had to do a lot of work myself to just be more aware as I get into certain spaces and look around and see what that is. Yeah.
I think about the paradoxes of the way that we present a lot, because in some ways we're hyper visible, we're readable, right? People look at the panelists, people look at us and they're like, oh, queer, oh, butch, you know, in a way that my partner who is femme gets quite frustrated sometimes, as she is not read as queer unless she's sort of, you know, holding my hand or something. So there's this idea that we're the most visible or readable of lesbians, but then I think that there's also ways in which we're the most invisibilized, right? Because we're not the right kind of woman, we're cast aside, we're not seen, we're disregarded. Like the number of times, it's a simple example, but the number of times, you know, somebody will come up and talk to, usually straight men, you know, talk to my partner as if I'm not even there. Like I don't even read as not just a woman, but don't even read as a person to that person because I'm not who they want to see. And it's something that strikes me in all of these sorts of situations, like you were mentioning, Tiona, about this paradox of, almost a paradox of who we are. If just kind of going off of what you said. And I find that surprising sometimes, this hyper visibility that then becomes invisibilized.
Yeah, and then there's another part about sexualization, right? There's been spaces where I've been, you know, I have a lot of femme women who are straight, who are like my closest friends, right? And I also have, you know, like just a range of people, but I've been in spaces where it's like, you know, straight up, you know, sisterhood, we're not even talking about that. And I found myself, and, you know, not to like say it's like, you know, causing the pain or of what the opposite of this is, but I've been sexualized in times where I don't want to be. I know that my body creates a certain tension around women, especially within like queer communities, you know, lesbian communities. That's happened often. And I have had to fight very hard for my femininity, to, you know, for that to not be disavowed, for that to be acknowledged, and also had to fight for a certain kind of softness in some of those spaces, because there is still an expectation of how you should be. Maybe if you carry yourself in a certain way, or the things that you can do, and that trickles down to some nasty patriarchal unlearning that I think everybody has to do.
Yeah.
There's a thing that happens every now and then that's still one of the most like emotionally complex things for me, which is when, if I put on like mascara or eyeliner, people will like straight up say like, oh my God, you're so pretty.
Yeah.
Like, who knew? It's confusing because it's one of those moments that I'm like, well, fuck, like, what did you, like, was I not before, or what does it mean to see that I am? Like, why do I feel like I should have been this whole time, and why do I feel like resistance towards that? Like, it's just, it's wild when people say that kind of thing. And I felt like, I mean, you know, growing up as a kid, it wasn't until I was, as a kid, I remember being in school, and like in middle school, everyone starts kind of, a lot of people start kind of shedding the tomboy thing because they're suddenly aware that, like, you know, someone might want a hand job. And so you kind of, my friends all started shaving their legs and plucking their eyebrows and wearing skirts that were like short. And I just wanted to wear like, you know, my fucking Mickey Mouse overalls all day, every day, and my Jordans, and just like not comb my hair, because I felt so weird drawing attention to myself if I've made myself look pretty. And I just remember these excruciating moments every single time we were in the locker room in gym class, and everyone's like applying their mascara in the mirror, and I would just be hanging out by the stalls behind all of them so that I wouldn't have to see myself in the mirror with them, because it just, I was in the wrong locker room. Like at any moment they were going to turn around and be like, Roberta, it's like, you don't belong here, you know? And it's just a confusing thing of being like, I don't know what I feel like in comparison to you. Not knowing the vocabulary, being like a 12-year-old and not knowing how to even describe yourself to yourself, or even investigate who you are. Without, like, deeply hurting. And aside from that, having, you know, my parents being like, stop, like, why don't you ever want to wear this? Why do you only want to go outside and play soccer, basketball? Like, why do you, you know, all your interests are male interests? Why does, you know, my mom would sometimes get upset when she, you know, when I would call home from somewhere and someone else would pick up, she'd get on the phone and say like, oh, I thought it was a man on the other line. You know, it's like Kerry, you were saying, all the training that you start to slowly get.
Mm-hmm. And I became, I did that for a while. I was still a tomboy and very athletic in high school, but I did that. I don't think I'd ever changed my walk. My walk was just, this is just the way I walk. But I feel like looking at pictures of me, Casey, you said you look at some pictures and you feel deeply uncomfortable. I look at some pictures of me from high school when I tried to date boys and had long hair and wore the makeup. And I mean, I always laugh, and I bring these pictures out sometimes because my friends find them hilarious because it looks like I'm in drag.
Yeah.
You know, it's so deeply not me. Yeah. But I went through I tried, I guess, to go through a fit. And then, I mean, as soon as I started women's studies, I majored in women's studies and English in university, that all went. Then I felt like, oh, this is where I get to be me, you know, in university.
Yeah. It makes me think of, go ahead.
Sorry? The funniest thing about looking at pictures like in college where I was like trying to be like more femme or something is that I'm trying to smile like straight girl smile, but I'm still doing like full on lesbian.
Straight girl smile.
Straight girl.
And you can't look right at the camera. You also have to look askance if you're doing this straight. You have to be a bit demure. You can't be like,
the things you learn. It used to, like, for me it was really tough because I was a jock in middle school. I played, and it was a cool way to hide, but then you realize, like, okay, you know, when your mom starts to kind of critique, like, why you gotta do this so much, why you have to basketball in this way. But I'm like, nobody's asking about this girl here just because she still, you know, wears a lipstick and all this shit. But it's like, in the locker room, I immediately was so overwhelmed by that prep because my mom had done it for so long. And I mean, we're talking about the full face. I saw it every morning. But then seeing it like come into like my age, because it was such a distant thing. It's like an older woman doing this. But I was like, whoa, like I don't have the time for it. Like in my head, I was like, I gotta get on somewhere. Like, you know, like how it just seems so burdensome. So, I mean, luckily I did have good friends who actually talked to me about how actually difficult it was for them to kind of keep up these ideas of, you know, femininity. They don't like it when their mom asks, where's their lipstick? Or, you know, these things that were really happening at the parallel that showed me that there's also that burden of femininity. There's some folks like within that, they didn't want to be that, you know, kind of Southern Belle or pretty. Like pretty in the South for me was a way of being. It's not even so much an aesthetic. It's like, how are you pretty in your body? Very, very violent, like, you know, to a lot of the, you know, girls who would talk to me about the things that they had to do and wear and shit like that. So I don't know. I'm very thankful for seeing it on both sides, but I know that shit scared me because middle school is like the most terrifying thing ever. It's like shit just starts happening out of nowhere and nobody gives you a heads up.
I remember, I think, you know, what it makes me think of is just kind of like patriarchy, right? Yeah. Like you use the word and it's like, you know, there's this system and it's a very specific type of patriarchy, you're kind of like white supremacist patriarchy that we're under here in the United States. It manifests differently in different parts of the world. Mm-hmm. I'm French. I spend half my time in Australia, but I'll keep it here to the United States. And I was raised by Americans and I was raised by a patriarch. And it makes me think of kind of, as we're talking about all of these things, what we're iterating, not only for ourselves, but for feminine presenting people, femmes, you know, straight feminine people, is just kind of like the edges that we all kind of collectively end up against because we're not men. You know what I mean? Like it is either not enough, or it is wrong, or it is insufficient, or it is you know, it is too masculine, too feminine. And nowhere in this is the ability to kind of celebrate fierce femininity as a position of strength, right? Yeah. Nowhere, because there isn't even a place for our bodies as butch bodies to be celebrated from a position of strength. Like it is kind of, it's so much so that it was an anomalous article in T magazine, and it was like, and we all turned up, and it was like, no, there are actually a lot of us, and where we actually all know each other and each other's work, and like we look fucking good, and no one's gonna like explode because we're all in the same place. And it's so beautiful because a lot of our wives, in my case, you know, fiercely femmes, like super powerhouse intellect of a woman turned up, because it is still impossible, because we're so visible, right? It's still somehow in this patriarchy psyche impossible to celebrate her type of fierce femininity, right? Like it's somehow like articulating that as absent from patriarchy, there are no words, right? Like, and think about like all of the privilege that we collectively, the four of us, but also in this article, had to have as masculine. Like, and there were like 5 like MacArthur Genius Awards in there, Oscars, like it was like the top of the fucking top. And it was only then that we were all allowed to show up in the same room. You know what I mean? And only then that we were like, there actually is a lot of language about us and who we are. And I just, you know, kind of think of the beauty of these women who showed up on set, my wife included, who were there because there is still the absence of their history being told, right? She has had to look so hard for who she is. Like, you know, because in some of the same places that I had to look, right? But I just think it's like so, like that, you know, what we're up against. And like you said, you know, Tiona, it's like kind of being able to see it from both sides. But like what I find that I'm up against and quite enraged about right now, particularly, maybe always, I don't know, it doesn't feel that exceptional, is the limitations and kind of like the stupidity of patriarchy. That it just kind of like dumbly insists on it being the reference point. And I'm like, it is so boring. I cannot deal. And so I find it so exciting when we all get together in places like this and think about like, what are the ways in which we can start kind of like, you know, for those of us who choose to engage, but like critically engaging with this stuff, you know, and storytelling and bringing language that was, you know, unspoken in many ways for us. But, anyway, that was, so it's about 5 till 2. Do we want to like open it up to question? Roberta, do we want to just like keep?
I ask a question to you guys. How do you feel? And I ask this because you were just talking about things that you are enraged by frequently, and I live in a state of rage, especially towards the thing, the WCW. The Woman Crush Wednesday thing.
Yeah.
That bothers me the way that it deeply bothers me.
I think all of it's silly.
Yeah.
Maybe explain it in case some people, can you explain it, Roberta, in case some people don't know what you mean? Yeah.
The concept of like, I am straight as hell, but like my girl crush is really girls. Like why do you have to, like, do you have a crush on her or do you fucking not? Like,
yeah, no. I can tell. No, because it's like a real thing. You don't, like, I don't know what anything is until I'm tagged. So I'm on Instagram. So I'll get, early on, people kind of like got used to, because I'll remove that shit. like no. My Woman Crush Wednesday is Tiona, and I would XYZ, and it's a tag, and I like, you know, wake up in the morning, and it's like this whole narrative of fantasy, and I'm just like, well, what in the world? It's like that kind of, again, it's that there's flattery, I guess, in ways I think within the community, if you want to be that, but it's a little burdensome, you know, and again, sexualized, you know, when you're just like waking up and you're trying to figure out if you're a person or not, you know, in the world, and then it's like
civilization.
Yeah,
this is what I wanted you to do to me.
I wouldn't take her seriously, for fuck's sake, but I would absolutely let her go down on me. You know, like that's.
Yeah, that's exactly the language. Always like hardcore pornography, like, you know, fantasy, like what they call it, fan fiction.
Yeah.
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 I think that one of the things that that rubs up against is kind of like, you know, is objectification, right? Like it, and I think, Kerry, you can talk to this a little bit based around the article, is it's like, I think, and, you know, Roberta, it makes me think of like the limitations of the descriptions of butch characters, right? Like the only thing that's possible is that this person be broken in some way, because that is the only thing that would justify them kind of owning their body and owning their space, because that is insane given kind of the price that one has to pay for that, right?
Yep.
We all saw that, Roberta, just saying. And
guys, this is a public conversation.
You know, it makes me think of like the objectification and what it means to kind of like be one-dimensional in that way, and again kind of brings me back to this shoot where it was like, it was so hard to get in there, the accomplishments that was present in this space all at once. It was like, no, these are not just sexy ass bodies, which they all are, right? These are actually, the way that these people can exist is because they have had to be excellent. It is despite everything that we are all here in this room.
Right, high tech.
This is my analog screen share, guys.
Well, you're right.
I think there's something I wanted to say on the other side of that, you know, like ideas of exceptionalism, which is something that I've had to deal in various areas of my life, right? To be Black and exceptional, to be butch and exceptional. You know, truly, it's like I tell people to this day, it's the way that I evaded a lot of the homophobia as a kid, because I was good at a lot of stuff. I was really smart. Not without it, because I mean, you get in there and it becomes a little bit more technical and like subversive, but and violent nonetheless. But you know, like even, you know, I think the while it was really important to be able to be seen in this way, you know, when I was in this space and around everybody, these people that I admired and people that I'm like coming into, like, man, I've seen, you know, shows, you know, and things like that. That folks are in, and I understood that it was kind of a little sad, because I was like, it really, you know, this is what it looks like to present this larger conversation. And I know so many folks who are not maybe quote unquote exceptional in those ways, who are just as valid, who would maybe look at this and feel proud, but it's also still, of course, very telling about how survival works, you know, like how you have to be someone who's maybe like deemed a certain kind of like attractive in a certain way to be able to then, you know, have this kind of a space. And it made me very reflective of my own practice. And, you know, very thankful for the first project that I did that just looked at 50, you know, lesbian women who were not of, you know, a certain kind of like a range, I think, of like, you know, folks who are just living their lives, and then these professional people that have these big names, pre-internet. And like, you know, I don't know. I think there's something that we have to challenge in the age of like commodification around these kind, you know, having these bodies and producing art in certain spaces that that was a bigger thing that rang out to me. And that it's like celebrate, but also, let's, you know, in my work, I have to like make sure that I don't like hinge on the excellence of it all at all times.
Yeah. And I think that that is exactly it, is it was like, you know, for me too, it was like so beautiful and also like so poignant, because I was like, every single motherfucker in here has had to fight so fucking hard.
Absolutely.
And we all do, right? Like we all have friends who weren't on that shoot, who were so stoked that we were there. But it was like, what would it be like if we could just like fucking be?
The idea of fighting so hard also, for me, it's important for me to talk about too, because you have to fight so hard to even understand yourself, like and like against the world and their definition of you and their perception of you and what they want to do to you violently, physically, whatever, sexually, objectively. But like I just, you know, in thinking about the lack of intersectionality within representation in the media of butchness, like, and even homosexuality in general for communities other than white communities. Because in media, when you think about a book about the story of immigrants in California, or a TV show about a Black family in Philadelphia, or any of those things, the entire idea, the entire story is limited to, it's perceived as like, you're only going to talk about issues extremely relevant to being Black. You're going to talk about issues about being an immigrant and like not having money and like, you know, all the stuff. And there wasn't until like the show that I'm on, Vida, that really people started, you know, there are queers, right, that are Latin American, you know, that we also like multiple identities intersect. And it wasn't, I mean, even thinking about, you know, and it's non-accidental that I didn't know that Chavela Vargas was gay until 5 years ago. But I knew the second that I heard about Oscar Wilde that he was gay. And right after finding out about William Shakespeare, I found out that he could have been a queer. You know, like all these James Baldwin, you know about James Baldwin, but then people kind of like shield, but he was gay, and we don't want to tell you because it might elude the whole thing behind his messaging if you know that he's also gay. And so, and I just, in thinking about like how protective Latin American identity is of just being Latin and not building the world from understanding that we could be gay too. There wasn't even in literature, there wasn't even any studies being done, anyone even acknowledging homosexuals or homosexual themes in Latino American writing until 1995, which is I mean, it's completely insane. And of course, like, that's a kind of struggle that you have to overcome as a gay person who is Latin, to like just even understand that there were people like you, because the message has always been, you might be the first one, motherfucker, you know, which, so it's, you know, and like, that's our understanding, is we just don't have like the cultural context. We don't have like the history of who we are. And like, even in books about queer writing and stuff, of 60 writers that are even brought up, not for necessarily being gay, but even writing on gay themes, 13 of them were writing about lesbian themes. Those aren't women writers. Those are just people that brought up lesbianism, you know? So it's wild. It's wild. And even—
It's very wild.
Even in like when there's conversations about culturally about, you know, gay people. I mean, even what's the gay magazine? Not Go. Out magazine. You know, there was a year that the cast of Fun Home was in Out magazine. The queer cast of the show Fun Home was featured in Out 100 of the year, and there were like, I can't remember, but there were like less than 30 of us were female people. And I just remember, I mean, it's a constant erasure of just like, you know, be gay too. It's not just like a male defined world, you know? So.
Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, that's been important to like my practice. A lot of my work that actually, I think, quite frankly, gave me a break in the last couple of years was dealing with obscurity. You know, what happens, because what is even more frightening, I know from my perspective and, you know, my research and also like my peers, because I have like this 1 degree separation from a lot of these people who have passed away for across many circumstances, both men and women, is that they were quite prolific. Now, what happens is that, you know, like, I think the circumstances of what it means to try to deliver a certain narrative, the ones who fought to do it were self-publishing, right? So I would like go into, like, you know, you go into archives trying to look up information on somebody, and this person maybe spends their life feeling that they're a failure, but they're in books that are self-published, but also like out of print. Which kind of takes them out of this, like, you know, conversation of like historical, like what exists now. And that's like, to me, the biggest heartbreak, even, you know, with, you know, Black lesbian elders, Black women elders, Butch elders, et cetera, because a lot of that, those photos are hidden in the back of the photo album, you know. Those are the ones that get taken, and, you know, that's when you get into conversations of like, you know, a term that a scholar uses there is both double cremation, you know, like how you live a big life, but then that life is erased again, because there's a certain kind of presentation of legacy if the family has to take over. So that's been even more painful for me, because like when, you know, you get into thinking about images of like, you know, Black butches, there's speculative ideas around these unnamed people that folks find, and those end up in like Library of Congress, you know, all these different archives. Whereas I do, you know, other cultures, like, you know, disclosure, you bring up disclosure, there's elements that they touched on that were so beautiful. I'm talking about trans narratives that introduced me to folks who are living in the 30s and stuff. And I'm like, wow, this research is amazing. Whereas mine literally comes from going to see an elder woman, and here's the picture that's folded apart, and she's like, this is a friend. I saw this photo that I found when I was 15. I never knew who these people were. So that's always been very painful for me, because I think it exists. The possibility is there, you know, like even my charge professionally and artistically has been to often like make space for references that I was robbed from, you know, create work and allow people to have access to these images, these women and these men who produced so much work, but that they could have referenced, that could have saved them a couple of years. You know what I mean? Whether personally or artistically. So I think there's something that is very strong and necessary around, like, you know, fucking with ideas around the academy and what language, quote unquote, they sometimes give us. Because I don't like, I'm 1 foot in, 1 foot out. I believe in that, but oral histories, you know, are just as important to kind of create these formations, even if they are, you know, what they will say, fabulations or ideas around like memory or not real. Like, you know, I have a big fantasy Butch that was in my head that was pieced together by a lot of ideas and slurs, quite frankly. It's like the one Butch that my mom and my aunts would go off about. This fucking bulldagger. You remember that bulldagger used to come in, no name. I never knew the name. She used to wear, you know, overalls, and I'm like secretly taking notes, like, okay, overalls.
You're wearing
boots. I'm like overalls, boots, ball cap, you know, like, you know, this is it. You know, I'm like, this is the vibe. And that helped me kind of create the idea of something to look forward to style-wise, but also life-wise. Because I'm like, the shit that they said that they hated, I was like, man, I'm trying to do that right now. I want to change your tire. Like, y'all not changing shit. Or I want to know how the car works in this way. I'm like, this is not next. But it's like that kind of language, even in like, I think some of the more traumatic areas or negative, can sometimes kind of create like this thing that becomes something you just want to hold. But it's true. It's true. The suppression or erasure of these narratives have been horrific. But I always want to challenge that, to say, like, you know, what you saw is what people allowed to get through. Yep. When you go and actually get with people, that's the unhidden things that'll be there that can change the whole like canon or the timeline, the historical timeline.
Totally. Yes, like we might, you know, I keep thinking about storytelling, and in Australia, a lot of folks talk about, well, I mean, it's all oral history in Aboriginal communities, and so it's passed on from one to the next, and it's a long, unbroken civilization, 40,000 years. So you have stories that date back, that have been orally passed on from one to the other. But they also talk about, you know, one of my wife's mentors talks about, like, we might not be the, you know, we may not, you know, see the change that we want to see, but it, you know, her particular charge is to tell the story so that it at least is there, right? Like the story of, you know, Mary Oliver, one of her last little sentences in one of the poems that's about, I'm obsessed with birds, so this poem's about a bird, but she says, and just like that, a small, you know, kind of neighborhood event is happening. And it was like, but she's talking about the laying of an egg in this small nest that's in the eve of her, that only she sees. And it makes me think of all of these narratives and the erasure that does happen and that has to be unfolded and held and talked about. And I, you know, one of the reasons why I said yes to this panel is because I do think that it contributes to, you know, in some way, us bringing in to this space the stories that aren't here because, you know, they're not, you know, they're not here. So we get to hold some of that, right?
Questions?
Yeah, I think we should go to questions. Do you guys feel good about that?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
You ready for
What
the first
happens
one?
now, Natalie?
I can read you one. So this is from an anonymous person. And this, I think, is to your point, Casey. When you first introduced yourself, you were sort of talking about Eminem and what you were listening to. So following the convo about masculine privilege, my question is on queer accountability and role models of masculinity. For example, the first comment on the panel was about Eminem, which was very triggering given the peak of his popularity was about 10 years ago, of him shouting violent slurs against gay men and advocating violence against women, while getting lots of play at lesbian bars. So I ask, what is the place of toxic masculinity in the Butch community? Ooh, that was a weird one to go Freudian on. Let me start that again. What is the place of toxic masculinity in the Butch community, and how does this impact other queers and women? This is a loaded question, so take your time.
No, I think it's a great question. I don't think they're loaded questions. I think that they're complicated questions with really complicated answers and complexity to them. Do you guys want to launch in?
It's one of the things that is a struggle within the Butch community. Sometimes people do, for self-preservation reasons, align themselves with more toxic masculinity. In order to feel safe within their own communities, they have to, if they're pretending, sometimes they actually have to internalize these feelings of just like full on toxic masculinity in order to feel safe presenting as who they are, and so that others can say like, well, she's kind of a dude anyway, so she's cool, you know, and yeah, so there's a huge amount of toxic masculinity. And it goes both ways, because like the thing that I was saying about the woman crush Wednesday or the girl crush is that like it's assumed that you're gonna, it's almost like it's assumed that you're gonna treat her like a dude would, you know, it's problematic, and it goes both ways.
So a question for you guys, for me, do you feel like you've had to unlearn some of that, the machismo, particularly I think with you, Tiona, and with you, Roberta, being part of specific communities? Do you feel like you've had to unlearn the way that people should treat women?
I again, with like the acting stuff, it's so common to have, with the Latin Butch characters, to have the understood sense that it's a full-on Lothario, that this person's just like, what's up, girl, you know, kind of to all these characters. And it's of course there's inherent machismo that's perceived in all of these characters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the responsibility. I mean, it's a responsibility that I took very personally, have been speaking about in multiple spaces of what it means to deal with masculinity that is also rooted in a place of fear, which can come off as extraordinarily violent, and working towards a way of understanding a settled, individualized masculinity. I was like kind of a loner kid, so I had to really work through a lot of stuff on my own. But I also, like, again, growing up around a lot of violent, men who were hyper masculine, that was never something that I was interested in being, because that was also a threat towards me. Or a danger to me. So I think the things that I'm doing now, like in my 30s, have been around like softness, around like kind of trying to relax in spaces and trying to work through anticipations of violence on my body, but also being very mindful of the ways that I, without even speaking, enter a room can make someone who is dealt with a certain kind of brand of masculinity because of the way I look, shrink in a space. And feel voiceless. Those are things that I've tried to do within my profession as well. Like in meetings, I have been a little bit more vocal or mindful of these things, just so that there's awareness that, you know, there is still going to be power and privilege around masculinity because of the dominant narrative that's in this country overall. It takes each individual to kind of like rebuke that inherent violence that comes along with that, to kind of change the spaces one person at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think I had to unlearn toxic masculinity. I think we all know it so intimately that it's about constantly fighting against it. I mean, again, as a masculine of center woman, I don't emulate or try and be in any way like men. All of the models of who I want to be in the world are quite soft. As you say, Tiona, let that embracing softness in embodying it along with our masculinity, along with the way that we present. I mean, in terms of this question of toxic masculinity, where I keep coming up against it is straight men who assume I'm like them and want to talk with me about women, like shit talk
Absolutely.
women, or it's like, who do you want to fuck at the bar kind of thing? Who would you do if you could take anyone? And I'm like, they assume I am, because of the way that I look and the fact that I'm a lesbian, I'm one of the guys. And we talked a little bit about this idea of we're one of the guys when we talked before this panel, that it can be really liberating being treated as one of the guys. It can also be so gross. Like, I am not that kind of guy. I am not that kind of guy, and I will not talk about women in this way. I'm not a dude. I don't want to be a dude. I get mistaken for a dude all the time, especially in bathrooms. But I am not that. So I feel like it's just fighting against that is just part and parcel of my feminism. And it would be that way no matter how I looked. And it was that way when I looked more like a girl in high school. I was still, I was wearing the makeup and had long hair, but I was the feminist, and I was trying to fight against patriarchy all the time. That hasn't changed, with the buzzed hair and the button-ups,
I don't know if you guys have had a similar experience, and I don't even know if I was projecting this onto women my whole life or whatever, but I had this sense when I started really, because it was kind of early on that people started being like, you seem like a lesbian, like when I was a kid, and I was just horrified by that. But then learning kind of like in high school and college especially, like learning that some girls would just get really kind of like, when I was talking to them, and then feeling like what they were sensing is that I was hitting on them because I was a big woman. And just like feeling so predatory by even just talking to someone, because I knew that they were assuming that just in talking to them, I was flirting with them, that I wanted to have sex with them. And it made me so creepy and like absolutely misunderstood, obviously, and hurt. But it's such a weird feeling to think that you're like making someone feel unsafe when I don't have a violent toxic masculinity within me. I mean, of course, I've like had my moments of being kind of a dog or whatever, but not in any way where I was actually a predator, So, yeah.
It makes me think of, when I think of my formative years and where I come from, I was an athlete. I went to the Olympics in 1996, and there is not more misogynist an environment than athletics, particularly in the 90s. And so I was on the receiving end of violence as a girl, and I understood what it meant to be a guy or what it meant to be a man through these. Like it was, 8 years isolated, a bunch of teenagers all together, no adult supervision, Lord of the Flies shit, where you're like, that's what it means to be a guy. That's what it means to be a girl. And the girl is often subjected to horrible violence. Like that is what that means. And so, but then, I came out, I, went into the closet in my own gender identity. And then at the very kind of like my late 20s, I actually partnered with a Butch. And that Butch ended up being physically violent. And so I know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that degree of toxic masculinity from a Butch, not only just men, right? Like when I was younger. And so I think one of the things that is often a challenge for me to reconcile when I'm going into places where, like the modeling, where I am being met with animosity at the best, and at the worst, this desire to put me in a place that is not mine, having the ability or know how can I access rage, right? Like when is rage permissible? And when is anger, and when is, how can I, in those moments, and at the time, I'm talking 2013, the only access I had at that particular moment in my mind that embodied the degree of aggression that I was being met on was embodied by the lyrics specifically of that one song. I also think that typically, again, kind of like holding the complexity of who we are as individuals, but also kind of like that nothing is monolithic, right? Like and this doesn't, and there are limits to that. However, it might be an American thing, I'm not sure. I'm French, and so I really believe in the possibilities that come. There's a tractor driving by. That's actually what's happening right now. But there are possibilities that happen in conversation and in difficult conversations. And I can imagine that question was probably not an easy one to ask from the panelist, but also for then you, Natalie, to say, well, how do you all, as masculine presenting bodies, as someone who identifies as hard femme, right, say, so what about toxic masculinity, right? Like, I think that it's these are the things that we must talk about. We have to, because if we keep not putting words to them, then they become erased, and somehow the complexities of who we are and the things that we have to not unlearn, but like not fucking be like. Because I mean, like Kerry, it's like I am so familiar with toxic masculinity. It's like,
guys, is it okay if I use the restroom really quick? I really have to see it.
Go for it.
yeah, we'll take another.
We'll give you a hall pass.
Yeah, can we take another question?
Yeah, let's take another question.
Of course. So I'm thinking about the exclusion of queer folks. So this comes from Lola Flash. So the name is Lola Flash. I'm thinking about the exclusion of queer folks, often being excluded from the BLM movement, and seeing a clear parallel to the New York Times article and this panel. There is an offensive erasure of senior members in our community. No Black seniors over 60 here and in the article. And how would JEB and Peggy Shaw, both Butches, whose entire body of work celebrates lesbians, not be invited? Going forward, how do we ensure that the gatekeepers stop omitting certain folks?
I mean, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, one thing is to, I want to unpack the question itself, is in regards to, you know, when we say queer folks, Tony McDade was a trans man. And identified and such, and you know, the horror of misgendering and things that happen after the death is something that's very much tied to BLM's Black Lives Matter. A lot of the press, as well as the way the media has covered things, of suppressing and being extraordinarily transphobic towards trans men and trans women. In the article, from my perspective, Eileen is 70 years old. There were other women that I met who were well over 60. And that was like, you know, the beauty of the conversation. And I think that, you know, the two, you know, Peggy Shaw, who I'm not familiar with, but Jeb, who I was on a panel with Jeb and Lola. So, you know, there's panels that have happened. And I think that, you know, I know for me, when I participate in these things, there's something that comes up with like this idea of representational politics. And labor, which is why, you know, this year for me, I was taking a break. You know, we all know internally, I was actually pulling out from all panels. So there are panels and there's places, but I think that there's something that is coming up that is a bit of a reckoning around the voices that have had a stronghold that have cut other people out. Because I will say that oftentimes I see the same people talking many years within the community, you know, within communities on these panels. And so there, I've dealt with my fair share of ageism. What I will say with the New York Times being brought in to be a part of this photo shoot, it was one of the first times where there was a proper spreading out. And I came in knowing some people and was introduced to a lot of folks. So it felt good for me to be there. You know, in terms of gatekeeping totally exists to me. And I think that it's definitely a problem. But there also is a certain kind of reassessment around the past and the gatekeeping that happened with white lesbians in relationship to Black lesbians. and erasure in those spaces. Also, I think that to me is something that is more of interest, of like re-examining what was happening then, because those things are documented, whereas some of our things haven't been documented. And I think that there are many individuals within the community that will give more space to those spaces of the heavily documentation, as opposed to the ones that we know of. You know, if we want to bring forth a lot of, you know, the people that I care about, you know, Cheryl Clark's, you know, Pat Parker's, you know, even Storm Ape, who has a film and things like that. There are people who have voices and who've been celebrated in some places. And then I think there's other places where there has been horrific erasure. And I think that right now, hopefully in this moment and moving forward, even with the complication of like these, the you know, whether it's physical space versus a Zoom, et cetera, that we all feel, you know, the impulse or feel encouraged to do that work as well on our own, and to like value ourselves in that way. Because I know I can speak for that in the ways that I've like produced my work, in the ways that I wasn't sitting around thinking about exclusion. I was making films. You know, I was making films, I was shooting people, and I was talking to people and trying to bring attention to that. So I think it's just a, you know, it's just a larger issue. Everybody can't be everything. I don't come on these things trying to be everything. You know, and I refuse it because I think there's a right for me to be an individual and speak from that place as someone who is 30, will be 39 next week.
Yeah. I can speak to the article a little bit. A lot of people, because I'm the writer of the article, a lot of the feedback has been directed towards me. A lot, hundreds of people found my website and emailed me, both with thanking me for the article, but also a lot of displeasure. A lot of people thought that I was responsible for the entire photo shoot, and that it was up to me, the writer, who was in the shoot, who was invited, who was not. So a lot of the mail I got actually didn't make sense for me, because I was brought in quite late. I was given the photograph and asked to write sort of a short history of Butch, you know, style and culture. So I worked with the photograph that I had. But one of the tough things is that there's this amazing diversity, as you were talking about, Casey. You look around that room, you look at that portrait and go, oh my God, there are people from their 20s to 70 or whatever Eileen Miles is, all amazingly accomplished, all amazingly diverse, right? That's one of the things that we keep talking about, is there's this assumption that Butch is one thing. It's the stereotype. And you look at a picture like that, or you're in that room, and that there are all kinds of sexualities and desires and identifications within this overarching thing that we call Butch, which can't be a monolith. What I find so difficult about this question is that when you know, the parameters of the shoot, not that I had to do the shoot, but they were allowed 25 people. So how do you contain? There are so many, and I'm so happy to say there are so many more people who could have been invited to that shoot, but they were limited to 25. So there were certain parameters, certain people got asked. That wasn't to say that people who aren't there are sort of not important. I got a million, I'm exaggerating, hundreds of emails about how could this person have not been there. And also, conversely, talk about policing our community. How could so-and-so be there? I can't believe you invited so-and-so. They are not Butch enough to be in this portrait. That's ridiculous that they're Butch, or that they're claiming that they're Butch, this sort of thing. So I don't know, these are really difficult conversations, because I thought there was quite an amazing diversity in the portrait itself. At the same time, I'm listening and I understand. I know a lot of people felt like there wasn't enough Butch elder representation. And the beautiful part of that conversation is that the emails I got about this were not, you guys did a bad thing, or it's, this is great, oh my God, we want to be a part of it. So I'm in a conversation with a group of Butch elders who want me to write a piece about them, like write about us. So like, let's tell more stories. Let's tell more stories. I wrote a piece about Jeb specifically for the New York Times. You know, like let's get these in all the venues. This T Magazine article could only do so much, and I think it actually did quite a lot.
Yeah, I have a
At the
project
same-
called for Black lesbian elders, you know, that
Yeah,
that has a
amazing.
life of its own, that's become this like force where people update and cull like and create an archive for these, you know, folks. So there's I don't know, there's a lot of things. I mean, it's so wild. I got the critique that there were too many older. I was just like, I didn't know. Yeah, it's one of those things. I was in a bubble, you know, and I actually didn't think I would ever be invited to something like that. You know what I mean? So it was also kind of one of those experiences for me myself.
The funniest ones I got, I think about 5 asking me how I could not care about your health and well-being because I put this shoot together in the time of COVID. Like, I can't believe you all got together. I'm like, oh my God, this, you know, just because it came out in the time of COVID, that's not when it was shot, you know. I don't know, the assumptions about how magazine profiles work and stuff were kind of amusing. It was amusing, really frustrating sometimes, but also made me laugh out loud.
Mm-hmm.
Casey, do you want to speak to this a bit? Because for those who don't know, Casey was not just in the Butch shoot, but produced it, yes?
Yeah, I produced it. I think that, you know, again, I just watched Disclosure, so a lot of the words from my sisters who were in that film are resonating, but, you know, it talks about how this idea, I think it was Professor Stryker, she says, you know, we should have more stories of trans women out there. And I think the same could be said for everyone who is in the queer community, butches, femmes, hard femmes, you know, soft butches, kind of in all of our complexities. And then the more stories there are, then the occasional clumsy one, which I don't think T Magazine was, but the occasional clumsy one then suddenly has a larger context within which to live. And I think that the frustration is that it was limited, and you should be frustrated.
Absolutely.
It was limited. It was like, it absolutely was. And I think that frustration is super valid and indicates the lack, the necessity for ongoing storytelling.
Yes.
Yeah. Do we want to take another question?
I was about to ask you that very question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So this is related to fashion, and so like on a slightly different angle. If anyone feels comfortable sharing, can you talk about your experience dressing or appearing butch in a professional space? I'm thinking about the idea of being taken seriously and or expected to present in a certain way.
I have always presented butch in professional. I mean, yeah.
I don't know. I don't, like, what is the idea of, but like, you know, like that, I don't know, maybe it's the idea of.
I'll be more specific. I always wear a suit when I'm at work.
Okay.
But now I'm wearing a t-shirt.
Yeah.
And
I don't know.
So I don't know.
I know what I could speak to though is how dress and going into certain spaces, like for instance, there's something that has happened to me, especially with the increase in travel, is like, you know, I have entered into women's bathrooms and have like been very aware of how I travel and how I dress in my body entering those spaces, and literally put myself through a certain process to kind of like, you know, take off a hood, you know, maybe even relax myself a little bit more, making eye contact, etc. Because it has been spaces, because I can be read as a Black cis man, depending on like my silhouette, as well as, you know, trans. So there's been more mindfulness around that. And that's in whatever I wear. I wear suits, you know, I wear a lot of streetwear stuff, pretty much wear the same thing every day, jeans and a t-shirt. But I think that's like, again, another idea around like a certain kind of, you know, a heteronormative idea of presentation. You know, there's like, I don't want people to think that just butch is like dressing in men's clothing also. There, you know, are various ways and tons of companies that are dressing women who have a certain kind of masculine body because of certain proportions. And sometimes things don't even cross over the right way. Like I'm not necessarily a slim person. Some women's jackets fit me a different way. But like seriousness has to be tackled in the larger conversation around fashion and what is acceptable in certain spaces. I can say, especially within the last year, there's a pressure that I felt going into meetings that I had to wear suits and stuff like that, right, to be taken serious. But then when I started to get certain things and I knew nobody was going to question my skill, I will show up there in my pajamas if it, you know, like, and so those kind of things, like, you know, it just comes down to, I think, you know, these really fucked up ideas around success, service as well, like, you know, the way people fashion themselves in certain spaces, as well as these outdated HR you know, requests. I know for some of my friends in spaces, they have like crazy requests of what they can and can't wear. Military folks have requests about what they can, how their hair can be, all these kind of nasty things. So it's a really good question. A lot to think about with that one.
Yeah, because it makes me think of this question of power. It makes me think about it. At the height of my swimming, I was known to actually show up in my pajamas and my slippers because I could, right? So there's power, and it didn't, it wasn't, and it was, you know, I was angry about it. I hated swimming, and I didn't feel like any of the coaches had my best interest at mind, but they didn't. But, you know, it was like, that was my power, right? My power was this skill that I had worked so fucking hard to do. And then suddenly, you know, I would show up with absolute disrespect for these people because they were not in their pajamas and slippers, right? But that was where I like took back my power because they wanted something from me, right? Like they were just like, they wanted this thing, they wanted me to perform. And so I think this question of power, like you said, Tiona, is like super interesting one, because it's like, how do you access it and subvert it, and where does it come from? And fashion is just one way.
For me, I've been able to make a career of thinking and teaching and writing about queerness. First, I'm an ex-academic. So I was an academic, now I'm a freelance writer, and I felt an incredible freedom as an academic. I went to a school that specifically supported, you know, interdisciplinary work, because I wanted to do like really queer projects and putting things together that don't necessarily go together and that kind of thing. The 2 of 3 people on my dissertation committee were queer themselves. One was a Butch mentor. So I felt an incredible freedom in those ways. When I was an academic, though, probably the worst homophobia I've ever experienced was in my teaching evaluations. You know, the way that the way that I presented was commented on, because, you know, those teaching evaluations are anonymous and they can be really fucking mean about how you look, how you present. You know, in a survey lit class, if I had even 2 texts that were remotely queer, you know, all she cares about is queer issues, fucking dyke, blah, 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 that sort of thing. So interestingly, and they were often, you know, these teaching evaluations were from very young people who had not yet learned to handle difference in their lives.
Own queerness.
Sorry?
Or their own closeted queerness.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so where I felt sometimes most self-conscious was teaching, not as an academic in you know, with my peers, my colleagues, but in teaching, I was very aware of my body and my, you know, my difference in the world.
Yeah.
You ready for the next one?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. This actually comes from Kerry Manders. Us trans guys are hearing so much about where the butches have gone. It's been a lot. We was seen as a dyke for half of my life, but I have always been male, not butch. I transitioned 20 years ago. Could the panelists address this topic of all of this sadness and anger about where have the butches gone? I'm empathetic, but it feels a bit transphobic. Thanks.
Again, I want to just say that the butches are there. Now, I think we have to think and be very critical about mainstream media and who they let in and who they put on covers, including this one, and the commodification of gay and trendy. And it's like, it fits the same patterns to me. Like, you know, I'm gonna spare everybody like the Prop 8 marriage, you know, respect, you know, all this other stuff. But that's all I'm pulling from into thinking about how we get to this moment where things are geared towards more beauty, you know, beauty standards are different. Ideas around newness are always going to be a culprit in regards to like presenting new and fresh and easily to be digested. I mean, one of the best representations I thought of this very issue was actually in Vida with Eddie and the young troupe that came in and was like kind of like trying to archive him in that space or her in that space. And I was just like, what the fuck?
Oh, you mean the same like
in the bar, and Eddie goes to the side and has to hear that information about being like
being called a queer.
Yeah. And I was just like, we have a lot of internal shit that we have to work out on dating or putting like age or this kind of like archival nature on identity. Like it's happened and I'm weird because I feel like at 39, I'm in between, you know, young folks and older folks all my life. And I've dealt with like both this weird tension. And I'm like, you know, I don't believe that there is something when people progress and come into their selves as they exist now, that is an affront or should erase anyone that existed before in a certain kind of a way. So they're still there. I don't know if people care to like center them in the ways that they are now because of, again, a certain kind of like investment in newness and pop culture that is not very friendly towards folks who identify as such. They've made them old. They've made that identity old, which is like very dangerous to me.
Yeah. I'm thinking, you know, in the 40s and 50s when, you know, your two ways, I mean, I'm completely simplifying here, but there's the idea of back then there were only two ways to be a lesbian, and you had to be butch and you had to be femme, or you had to be femme, and at the bar you had to identify as one or the other. And I don't know, I don't buy this narrative that you know, some people are putting forth of the disappearing butch. I think, Tiona, like you said, we're here and there are so many of us. I think one of the things that has changed, and I think I mentioned this in the T Magazine article, is that, you know, talk about getting out of this idea of butch identity being monolithic. There are just so many different now acknowledged ways of being in our sexualities and ways of talking about ourselves, from non-binary to trans masc to gender non-conforming to like all of the other ones are still in play too. You know, Tommy, Daddy, like all of these different, I feel like the language for the different ways in which we are, the different ways in which we identify, the different ways in which we desire have expanded so much in the last, I don't know, decade. And that those things are getting more play. And I think that there's this fear that the old-fashioned butch is no longer welcome, or, oh my God, we all want to be men and we're all going to transition and there will be none of us anymore. I think it's all a little misguided. And I don't see that in my life. I don't see the disappearing butch. In fact, I see in some ways a lot more. And Casey, you mentioned being in a butch couple, which is something I wanted to address, because there is this assumption that butch is always with femme, right? That there are ways of even coupling and desiring. And I was thinking when I was writing this article about how many butch couples I know. And that is something I don't think we see represented. Like that's not possible, you know, as Alison Bechtel said in our interview, like, whoa, that's a step too queer, like can't possibly show that. So I don't know, to me, they're kind of everywhere. And I don't, I'm very suspect of that narrative that we're disappearing.
Yeah, and I think you know, this idea of the disappearing butch is transphobic because it positions the trans person as not existing and then suddenly existing. And so, you know, to the person who's asking the question, I agree, it's a totally transphobic statement. But I identify as a trans butch person. So, and there were a couple of other people who are trans in the shoot. Who identify and have the lineage of butch elders. And I mean, my elders are butch, hardcore fucking dykes, and some of whom have transitioned, some of whom hadn't. But I think that, you know, the history of this question comes from a time where 20 years ago, when I was coming out, there was this privileging of masculinity within the queer community, or the white queer community specifically. And I think that that it's also important to remember kind of like where that question comes from. I don't know that it's, I think to kind of Kerry's point, we've seen enough to know that it's not true. Like it's not, it's not happening, but it is in fact a transphobic question for sure.
Yeah, Butch, I think, was robbed of a certain kind of fleshing out and gradient, you know, as well. Like, you know, I mean, I like, there's a portion of my film Black Woman where I was like devote 25 minutes to everybody saying all the different identities they've ever heard as a Black lesbian woman. And there's just like this soft bush, short bush. I mean, it gets wild. It's like, you know, and I think that you have to like also take into account some people's ideas around conservative elements. Not everybody is like a radical, you know, fuck with gender, fuck with presentation, queer, LGBTQ person. Some people are extraordinarily conservative and have those nasty internalized, like transphobic, internalized homophobic ways of being, and it like has wreaked havoc within our own community. It's like an in-house conversation, I guess, but it's like that's also a part of the issue.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. Makes me think of this beautiful answer that Angela Davis recently gave to one of the young ones who was asking her, like, how do you identify? And she gave like 25 things. She was like, anti-racist, abolitionist, queer, anti-capitalist, like went on, and then was like, so is that enough? And it was like beautiful, because I think that oftentimes, like, again, kind of like, it's kind of like this fight against, or not this fight, but just this texture between like the complexity of who we are and the multiple identities that I certainly hold, you know, on this body and my history, for sure.
Yeah.
Let's see. It's quarter till. I think we could take like one more question, maybe, Natalie. Yeah.
Yep. And it's going to be a fashion question, and I kind of adore this question. So, Diana Thorpe, I wonder if you could speak about butch adornment. I'm interested in the ways that butches or MOC folks choose to bring in touches of the feminine. Sparkle, jewelry, makeup, whatever it is. I noticed some necklaces and Roberta's cute one hoop earring, and thank you all so much. So how do you zhuzh up your look? How do you add a touch of feminine? I mean, or do you not add a touch of feminine?
It wasn't until like I mean, I came out of the closet when I was like 24. I mean, I started dating a woman when I was 21, but I didn't really tell anyone that I was gay. I mean, I kept our relationship in the closet for 3 years, basically. And it wasn't until I started telling people like, oh yeah, I'm gay, that I started finally feeling comfortable with experimenting with more feminine clothing and stuff. And I've always worn a lot of jewelry and things, but you know, yeah, I like ornamentation. I think it's really fun. I think we're in a really cool time now where we can just like fully experiment with everything and wear drag and feel at home in it, and it all feels really good. Someone actually said to me, Kerry, you were talking about earlier, how someone had commented that about the photo of the butches and studs, that there were people in there who don't belong in there. And I just asked you privately in the chat, like, was I one of those people that they were talking about? Because I had a friend,
your name was not mentioned.
I did have a friend that was just like, you know, in comparison, you're kind of not Butch to the, you know.
Is it because of what you were wearing? Is it because of the way you adorned yourself that particular day?
Maybe, although that's kind of how I dress. I wasn't like,
Right.
I like try or whatever. I did like consciously pick out an outfit that I thought wouldn't look shitty, you know, but
Right.
that's how I dress. And if we can't just limit understandings of Butch identity to what a person is wearing, that's so.
Or to race, because I think something else that came up was stud could only belong to Black folks. And I was just like, this is, as a Southerner, like the first time I ever heard stud as a young person was this white cowboy looking guy. My neighbors were like, he's such a stud. And I was like, what the hell is that? And and it's like, oh, it's this kind of like guy. So stud has had this evolution across time around a certain kind of like, you know, maybe a machismo, you know, big put out energy, when it has been embraced heavily by the Black lesbian community and elsewhere. But I don't think it belongs exclusively in that way. And I think that some of the ways that folks have been just completely sometimes stereotyped in that area has oftentimes done harm, because that it further proves this kind of expectation of this person who's supposed to deliver a certain kind of like sexual service. And that's something that has come up within like queer parties and things like that. There'll be like hot studs, young studs, and it's very like showy, which is nothing wrong with it if it's, you know, consensual and this is what you want to give. Like, I think they're incredibly gorgeous all across the board. But when it becomes something that keeps somebody unable to move and be seen as like, you know, outside of just an aesthetic and not like for their mind or their heart, it becomes an issue, you know?
Yeah. And it makes me think of, you know, kind of like the men that I grew up in the south of France, being like a Mediterranean country. Like the most masculine men were the ones with like the gold chains and like rings on all their fingers and the flowery shirts and they were straight. So when I see Roberta, like I read your masculinity because I grew up in a Latin Mediterranean country, and they had, you know, kind of like leisure suits and like matching top and bottom, like, you know, this is like 80s and 90s, but it was like, you know, a hyper femininity to it that gets read as hyper feminine when they come to the United States. But in France, you do not fuck with them. They're like actually some of the more dangerous, toxic, masculine men, but they are adorned to the teeth, you know? So I think that's so interesting because it holds within the context, again, kind of like what is adornment is something different in different contexts. And I think it's so important when we're having these conversations to remember that everybody has different reference points, you know, that one reference point could be hyper feminine, but in a context from where that person comes from, it's actually like a super masculine thing. Like I've always worn gold chains and I didn't know that it was like could be like a lady thing until many years into my queerness, right? Where it was just like, because that was what the men did. Like they just wore, you know, the chains and the, you know.
They mean so many different things. Like I did have someone like, you know, like last year comment on my bracelets, and I'm like, this is religious. Actually, it has nothing to do with, it's like my sign is a signifier that I'm a priestess. You know, there's a certain legibility here. I know maybe it looks cool, but it's not to be cool. I wear it every day because of a certain kind of commitment. So there's like, I don't know. It's like, when it gets into those kind of ways, I'm like, I get very much like, I don't know. Like, I'm more interested in how people represent their styles and what these things mean, you know, like what the chain means if it's given to you from someone as opposed to like a kind of a put on for a certain way of being.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know.
This is my wife's name. That's the gold chain I have around my neck, right?
Word.
I have several.
Yeah.
I have several, and some of them are things that I was told by my ancestors to wear to kind of ward off certain spirits. I have a knife for Ogun, my Orisha, and I have a one that's really special. is a puzzle piece because I live with autism spectrum disorder, and it's with a heart that was gifted to me from my gallerist.
I have, you'll recognize this from the Mediterranean, Casey.
Yeah.
I have a Nefertiti, I have a Catholic saint. You know, I don't practice Catholicism, but you know.
I'm wearing a chain that's a dog tag that my mom wore for the panelists know that my mom just died as we were putting this panel together, and this is one of the things I inherited from her. And I usually don't wear gold. I usually wear like white gold or silver, but this is like my entire life I remember this, or almost my entire life I remember this on my mom. So just to have it, I feel like she had planned to attend to be an audience member for this panel. So I wanted to wear something that, you know, she would be with me. So that's what this is.
So, as a Latin person, I just showed a baby photo to someone the other day, and it's the moment, you know, you're born, your ears are pierced. A bracelet slapped on, and like I still have it. Every time my mom goes home to Argentina, she comes back with a silver bangle bracelet, and it's just like, I got you another one. I'm like, it would be just like elbow solid, if you know, if I wore every single one she got me.
Yeah. I also have to say this because one I forgot is one that my girlfriend gave me, and I wanted to say it because she thought it would be corny. I've never been gifted one of these things. I've always wanted one. Like, she thought maybe it was too girly, and I was like, you have no idea. I feel like I've arrived. I finally got something because it's very, like, you know, dainty. It's like with both of our initials, and I was like, man, this is thrilling.
Right.
Yeah. I was so excited.
Yeah. Cool.
So that brings us to like
to your mom. And I feel like this is a good place for us to end.
Thank you all so much. There was lots of thank yous from the audience, just so you know. We really appreciate you showing up and attending this event, or being this event. Actually, you were at the event. And we are grateful to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
My pleasure. I'll be in touch with you guys soon.
Okay, thanks guys.
Bye.